The small town of Willow Creek was a place where time moved slowly, a haven for those who sought peace in the quiet hum of nature. The streets were lined with oak trees, their golden leaves drifting gently to the ground, signaling the arrival of autumn. Nestled at the end of a winding road, near the serene Lake Lillian, was a modest house that had stood for generations. This house belonged to Walter Everett, a retired schoolteacher in his late 70s. Walter had spent most of his life imparting wisdom to young minds, shaping futures, and instilling values in children who looked up to him. But now, his days were far quieter. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that time refused to fill. His only daughter, Emily, lived across the country in New York, caught up in the whirlwind of her career and family life. She called him every Sunday, a routine he cherished, but deep down, he longed for something more, something he couldn't quite put into words. Each morning, Walter would sit on his porch, a cup of steaming coffee in his wrinkled hands, and watch the sunrise paint the sky with hues of orange and pink. The world around him seemed peaceful, yet he felt an ache of loneliness settling deep within his bones. One particular morning, as he sat there staring at the empty rocking chair beside him, a strange sense of nostalgia washed over him. He remembered the days when that chair was never empty, when Margaret would sit beside him, her laughter filling the air as they reminisced about their youth. He sighed, pushing the memories aside, and stood up to start his day. Walter had a routine: wake up early, water the plants, read the newspaper, and take a slow walk to the town square. It wasn't much, but it kept him grounded. As he walked through the cobblestone streets, he exchanged nods with familiar faces: Mrs. Langley, the widow who ran the bakery; Tom, the postman who always had a story to share; and the Patterson twins, who played on the sidewalks without a care in the world. But something was different that day. As Walter reached the town square, he noticed a woman sitting alone on a park bench. She was elderly, like him, but there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored his own. Her name was Eleanor Dawson, a name he vaguely remembered from years ago. She had moved to Willow Creek a few months earlier, but they had never spoken. Walter hesitated for a moment before walking toward her. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he said, offering a gentle smile. Eleanor looked up, startled at first, but then nodded. "Yes, it is." There was a pausey and awkward silence that neither of them knew how to fill. But then, Eleanor spoke again. "I used to sit here with my husband. He passed away last year." Her voice was soft, tinged with sorrow. Walter's heart ached at her words. He knew that pain all too well. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," he admitted. For the first time, Eleanor looked at him not just as a stranger making small talk, but as someone who understood. "It never really gets easier, does it?" "No," Walter said honestly, "but some days are kinder than others." And just like that, an unspoken bond formed between them. They sat in silence for a while, watching the world go by, two souls connected by shared grief and the quiet understanding of what it meant to love and lose. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor stood up. "Would you like to join me for a cup of tea sometime, Walter?" Walter smiled, feeling something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'd like that." And with that, they parted ways, unaware that this simple conversation would mark the beginning of something neither of them expected. For the first time in years, Walter didn't feel so alone. The days in Willow Creek followed a steady rhythm: sunrise over the lake, children playing in the square, and the gentle hum of life moving forward. But for Walter Everett, something had shifted. The loneliness that had once been a constant companion now had a rival glimmer of companionship, a quiet anticipation that made his days feel fuller. It had been a week since his conversation with Eleanor Dawson, and though their exchange had been brief, it lingered in his mind. True to her word, she had invited him for tea at her house a few days later. The invitation had surprised him, not because he wasn't interested, but because he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be wanted in someone's company. On the day of their meeting, Walter found himself more nervous than he expected. He dressed with unusual care, choosing a button-down shirt that Margaret had once told him made him look dignified. He even debated bringing flowers, but then decided against it, not wanting to appear too forward. Eleanor's house was just a few blocks away from his own, a charming little place, with a white picket fence and a garden that, though slightly overgrown, still held traces of careful tending. As he approached the door, he hesitated for just a moment before knocking. The door opened, and Eleanor greeted him with a warm smile. "Right on time," she said. "I try," Walter replied with a small chuckle. She led him inside, where the scent of chamomile and something faintly citrusy filled the air. Her home was cozy, filled with soft lighting and bookshelves lined with well-worn novels. There were framed photographs on the mantel, old black and white pictures of her and her husband, their wedding day, a younger Eleanor holding a baby in her arms. Walter recognized the quiet echoes of love and loss within these walls. They sat in the living room, the steam from their teacups curling into the air between them. For a while, they spoke about small things: the weather, the town, the way the world seemed to move too fast these days. But soon, the conversation turned deeper. "You were a school teacher, weren't you?" Eleanor asked, stirring her tea. 38 years, Walter said, nodding. "I taught history." Eleanor smiled. "You must have loved it." "I did. There's something about sharing stories of the past that makes you feel connected to something greater. But it was never just about the subject, it was the kids. Watching them grow, helping them find their way. That was the best part." Eleanor took a sip of her tea. "And now? What do your days look like?" Walter hesitated. "Quiet. Too quiet sometimes." She nodded, understanding. "After my husband passed, I found the silence unbearable. I tried filling it with books, gardening, but some days it still feels like the house is too big, like the walls are closing in." Walter exhaled slowly. "It's strange, isn't it? You spend a lifetime building a life with someone, only to wake up one day and find half of it missing." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Yes, but I think the other half never really leaves. It just changes form." Walter considered her words, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. They spoke for hours that afternoon, finding comfort in each other's stories. Eleanor told him about her late husband, James, a man who had loved fishing and had a habit of whistling old jazz tunes while he cooked. Walter shared memories of Margaret, how she could never bake without covering the entire kitchen in flour, and how she used to sing softly to herself when she thought no one was listening. It was a conversation woven with laughter, with nostalgia, with a gentle unraveling of walls neither of them had realized they had built. By the time Walter left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Willow Creek. As he walked home, he felt something stir within him, a feeling that had been absent for too long. A few days later, Eleanor called him. "Walter, do you like fishing?" He laughed. "It's been years since I've held a fishing rod, but I used to." "Good," she said. "Meet me at Lake Lillian tomorrow morning. Let's see if we still have the patience for it." Walter smiled. "I'll be there." And just like that, a new chapter in his life had begun. Walter hadn't been to Lake Lillian in years. He used to come here with Margaret when they were younger, back when their kids were small, and their days were filled with laughter, work, and the promise of endless summers. The lake was a place of simplicity where the water met the sky, where the world quieted just enough to hear one's thoughts. Now, standing at the shoreline with an old fishing rod in hand, Walter felt something stir in him. A whisper of nostalgia, yes, but also something else, a feeling of anticipation he hadn't known in a long time. Eleanor was already there when he arrived, dressed in a light blue sweater, her hair tucked neatly under a wide-brimmed sun hat. She stood by the water's edge, watching the gentle ripples dance across the surface. "You're late," she said, turning toward him with a teasing smile. Walter chuckled. "Only by 5 minutes." She handed him a small tackle box. "Then you can bait your hook." He grinned, appreciating her wit. As they settled into their chairs by the dock, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the rhythmic sounds of nature, the occasional splash of a fish, the rustling of the trees, the distant hum of a boat somewhere far off. "So," Eleanor began, casting her line into the water, "do you think you'll catch anything?" Walter smirked. "Probably not. I think the fish are too smart for me these days." Eleanor laughed softly. "I think patience is the real trick. Not just in fishing, but in life." Walter nodded, reeling in his line slightly. "Patience isn't always easy, though." "No, it isn't," she agreed. "Especially when you're waiting for something you're not even sure will come." Walter glanced at her, sensing there was something beneath her words. "You mean happiness?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe, or at least something close to it. I spent years believing that after James passed, my best days were behind me, that all I had left were memories and the routines of a quiet life." Walter understood that feeling all too well. "And now?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "Now, I'm not so sure. Ever since we started talking, I feel lighter, somehow. As if the world isn't quite as lonely as I thought it was." Walter felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I feel the same way," he admitted. The words hung between them, gentle and unspoken in their weight. The lake stretched before them, vast and endless, much like the possibilities that suddenly didn't seem so distant anymore. As the morning wore on, they continued their conversation, drifting between lighthearted banter and deeper reflections. Eleanor told him about her children daughters who lived in different states, both busy with their own families. She spoke about how much she missed them but didn't want to be a burden, how she tried to fill her days with hobbies but still found the nights unbearably quiet. Walter shared stories of his children, his son, a lawyer in Chicago, and his daughter, a teacher like he had been. He spoke of their visits, how he loved them dearly but often felt like an afterthought in their busy lives. "They call me, of course," Walter said, adjusting his fishing rod. "But sometimes I think they see me as just their aging father, not as a person who still has a whole life to live." Eleanor sighed. "Isn't it strange? We spend our youth believing that one day we'll slow down, that we'll want nothing more than peace. And then, when we finally get it, we realize we were never meant to stop moving." Walter looked at her, realizing just how much he appreciated her company. In the short time they had known each other, she had become someone he could talk to, and that was something he hadn't realized he was missing. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor suddenly gasped, her fishing rod bending sharply. "Oh, I think I got one!" Walter chuckled. "Looks like you're better at this than I am." She struggled for a moment before reeling in her catch, a modest-sized fish, flopping wildly in the sunlight. She laughed, delighted, before carefully releasing it back into the water. "Beginner's luck," she teased. Walter shook his head. "No, just patience." They stayed at the lake until the early afternoon, packing up only when the heat became too much. As they walked back toward town, Walter felt a sense of contentment settles over him. The day had been simple, yet it had meant so much. Before they parted ways, Eleanor turned to him. "Walter, would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow? I make a mean pot roast." Walter smiled, feeling a rare sense of excitement. "I'd love that." As he walked home, he realized something incredible. The next evening, Walter stood in front of Eleanor's house, holding a bottle of wine. He had debated for an hour whether to bring something, flowers, perhaps, or a dessert, but in the end, he settled on wine. It had been a long time since he had been invited to someone's home for dinner, and he found himself unexpectedly nervous. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Within seconds, it swung open, revealing Eleanor in a light floral dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly. "You're right on time," she said with a warm smile. Walter grinned. "Figured I'd better not be late again. I brought this." He handed her the wine, and she chuckled. "Good choice. Come on in." The house smelled wonderful, a mixture of rosemary, garlic, and slow-cooked beef. It was cozy, lived in, filled with small touches that reflected Eleanor's personality. Books stacked on the coffee table, a few paintings on the walls, and a rocking chair in the corner. It reminded Walter of the home he had once shared with Margaret, the kind of warmth that only came from years of making memories in a space. As Eleanor set the table, Walter wandered to a bookshelf, running his fingers over the spines. "You're a reader, I see," he mused. "I always have been," she replied, placing the pot roast on the table. "Especially after James passed, books kept me company." Walter nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. "Margaret was the reader in our house. She always had a novel on her nightstand. She tried to get me into it, but I was more of a crossword puzzle kind of guy." Eleanor chuckled. "Well, maybe it's never too late to start." They sat down, and as they ate, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about their childhoods, their families, their regrets, and the dreams they once had. "You know," Eleanor said as she poured them each a glass of wine, "I used to dream of traveling the world." Walter raised an eyebrow. "What stopped you?" She sighed. "Life, marriage, kids, responsibilities. James and I always said we'd travel once we retired, but then he got sick. And after he was gone, it just didn't seem like something I could do alone. Walter took a sip of his wine, contemplating her words. Maybe it's not too late. Eleanor looked at him, surprised. You think so? Why not? Walter leaned back in his chair. People our age tend to think the best years are behind us. But what if they're not? What if there's still time for adventure? Eleanor smiled, a hint of something playful in her expression. Are you suggesting we run away and see the world? Walter chuckled. Maybe not the whole world, but I don't know. A road trip? A little adventure? Something different. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with amusement. You know, Walter, for someone who seemed so set in his ways when we first met, you're starting to sound a lot like a dreamer. Walter shrugged. Maybe I just needed the right person to remind me how to dream again. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than he had expected them to be. Eleanor studied him, a soft expression crossing her face. I like the way you think, she said finally. They finished dinner, and as Walter helped her clean up, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent so many years moving through life like a man waiting for something, though he never knew exactly what. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt present and hopeful. As he stood at Eleanor's door, ready to head home, she hesitated. Walter, she said softly. He turned back to her. Thank you, she said, for reminding me that life isn't over yet. Walter smiled. I should be thanking you too. He walked home under the moonlit sky, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow was another day, and for once, he was looking forward to it. For the first time in years, he wasn't just waiting for the days to pass. He was looking forward to them. A few weeks after that dinner, Walter sat in his favorite chair by the window, sipping his morning coffee. Something felt different. The old routine, the one that once brought him comfort, now felt incomplete. He had spent the last few years watching life pass him by, but Eleanor had reminded him that life wasn't meant to be watched. It was meant to be lived. That afternoon, as he walked toward the park, he found Eleanor sitting on their usual bench. She was reading a book, but when she saw him approach, she smiled and closed it. I was wondering when you'd show up, she said. Walter sat beside her, taking a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said, about traveling. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh? He nodded. What if we did it? Took a trip, just for a little while. See something new? Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. Are you serious? As serious as an old man can be, Walter said with a chuckle. No big plans, no schedules. Just a car, the open road, and a couple of stops along the way. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. You're not the same man I met a few months ago. Maybe not, Walter admitted. Maybe I was stuck in my ways. But I don't want to be stuck anymore. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. Well, if we're doing this, we better start planning. And just like that, a new adventure began. A week later, Walter stood in front of Eleanor's house with a packed suitcase. You ready for this? He asked. Eleanor smirked, tossing her bag into the trunk. I was born ready. They set off with no destination in mind, just the road ahead and the promise of something new. They drove through small towns, stopping at diners that had the best homemade pies, laughing as they tried new foods and reminiscing about their younger days. They visited places neither had ever seen before: quiet lakes surrounded by golden trees, a small museum filled with forgotten history, and a stretch of coastline where the waves crashed against the cliffs. One evening, as they sat outside a small bed and breakfast, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor sighed contentedly. "You know," she said, "I used to think adventure was something that only belonged to the young." Walter chuckled. "Turns out, we were just waiting for the right kind of adventure." She smiled at him, eyes twinkling. "I think I like this kind of adventure best." A month later, they returned home, their hearts fuller than ever before. Life went back to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. Walter no longer dreaded waking up alone. Eleanor no longer felt trapped by the past. One evening, as they sat on the same park bench where their story had begun, Eleanor looked at Walter with a thoughtful expression. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Walter turned to her, a slow smile forming. "I stopped thinking about it. I just want to live it." Eleanor reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. "Then let's keep living," she said, and so they did. Because life, no matter how much time had passed, was still worth living.